Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every mystery invites you to listen closer. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue takes us deeper into the unknown. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she uncovers a secret not written on paper, not spoken aloud, and not left in plain sight. It was hidden beneath something ordinary, a wicker chair, carrying a whisper no one else could hear. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind this quiet clue isn't just surprising, it's chilling. So, pour yourself a cup of tea and settle in, because Miss Marple and the whisper beneath the wicker chair will keep you guessing until the very last moment. Chapter 1. The whisper beneath the wicker chair. It was the sort of summer afternoon that seemed to hush even the bees. In the village of Little Whodunit, light filtered through the chestnut trees with drowsy purpose, settling in golden patches on the common. The smell of warm grass, overripe apples, and lavender hung in the air like a well-practiced memory. Life here rarely hurried. The postman took his time. Children walked barefoot without urgency, and Mrs. Bramley's hens clucked with the unshakable confidence of routine. On such a day, the Wadsworth Ladies' Society had convened for their annual summer fete, held in the garden of Mrs. Louisa Blackwood, a widow of no particular sorrow and considerable fortune. Her house, Ivy Fold, stood at the far edge of the village, its red brick walls half consumed by honeysuckle, and its windows perpetually half draped in lace. She had a tendency to speak as though every sentence were a farewell, and she served lemonade with slices of lemon so thin they might as well have been promises. The fete was as one might expect, tables groaning with sponge cakes and chutneys, doilies pressed to within an inch of their lives, and a raffle basket featuring no fewer than 3 tins of sardines. The atmosphere hummed gently with gossip, polite inquiry, and the occasional peal of laughter that seemed just a shade too forced. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a wicker parasol on the far side of the garden, her teacup balanced with precision, her gaze resting gently on everything. To the unobservant, she looked positively absorbed in embroidery. But Miss Marple, as ever, was listening. Mrs. Agnes Pike was holding court by the jam tarts, her voice rising in waves of feigned innocence. "Well, I didn't say it was arsenic. I only said I wouldn't be surprised. There's a difference." Behind her, Colonel Farnley was fumbling with the raffle tickets, his mustache bristling with indignation over the price of a jar of quince jelly. Nearby, the vicar's wife was attempting to soothe a disagreement over whether Mrs. Endicott's apple sponge had been purchased from a shop, a claim which Mrs. Endicott's face, reddening considerably, did not deny with conviction. It was all deliciously typical. That was, until the scream. It was short, sharp, and unmistakably real, the kind of sound that did not belong in the measured chaos of village frivolity. The fete paused like a held breath. Miss Marple rose, her parasol swaying slightly. The cry had come from the far end of the garden, where the older ladies had taken refuge beneath the ivy-covered pergola, escaping both sun and scrutiny. A path of trampled clover led to a small alcove half hidden behind a hedge of flowering currant, where Mrs. Blackwood kept several wicker chairs arranged around an old stone table. There, collapsed in one of the chairs, was Miss Delia Martin. She was a slight woman of 75. Known for her immaculate gloves and precise elocution. Now, however, her hat lay askew, and her mouth trembled as though she were still trying to contain whatever had startled her. I heard it," she whispered, eyes wide and unfocused. Mrs. Blackwood was already at her side, fanning her with a folded program. "Delia, what happened? Did you faint?" "No," she gasped. "It wasn't me. It was beneath the chair. A voice, a whisper." She shuddered. "I heard someone whisper my name." A murmur rippled through the crowd now gathering at the scene. Miss Marple approached gently. "Perhaps the wind," she offered in a quiet, non-threatening tone. "It has an odd way of turning the ordinary into something quite different." Miss Martin clutched her handbag tighter. "It wasn't the wind. It said my name, just once, like it wanted to be sure I heard it." There was silence for a moment, unusual, collective. "Suspicious." Colonel Farnley cleared his throat. "Likely a trick of the breeze. The heat does odd things." But Miss Martin shook her head. "I know what I heard." Miss Marple bent slightly, peering beneath the chair. There was nothing but lawn and a stray petal from a climbing rose. Yet her eyes, sharp and steady, lingered longer than they needed to. "Did you see anyone nearby?" she asked kindly. "No," Miss Martin said. "But I smelled something, like old violets. Not flowers, powder, perfume." This raised another murmur. It was, as the villagers would later agree, an odd thing. Eerie, yes, but hardly criminal. And yet, before the sun had set behind the hills that day, something else would happen, because that very evening, long after the guests had gone and the garden had been tidied, Mrs. Blackwood's housekeeper would discover something that made her drop the tea tray in a crash of porcelain and fear. Beneath the very same wicker chair where Miss Martin had sat was a small torn scrap of lace, and clinging to it, clinging as if it had been pressed by unseen fingers, were a few dried violet petals. Chapter 2. The powder scent that lingereth. Following morning dawned unusually quiet in Little Wadsworth, as if the village itself had paused to lean in and listen. The fate had become a thing of whispers overnight, not for the strawberry sponge or the failed raffle, but for what was now being referred to in hushed tones as the incident in the wicker chair. At the old vicarage, Miss Marple stirred her tea with the delicacy of one who had watched both storms and scandals brew. She had taken the morning paper as a prop, but her thoughts were elsewhere on that small, torn scrap of lace found beneath Miss Martin's chair and the faded violet petals beside it. Neither item should have caused concern on its own. Together, however, they suggested something left behind with intent. At the post office, the usual morning crowd had gathered under the guise of collecting letters. Mrs. Pike, naturally, was already deep into narrative invention. "I always said there was something theatrical about Miss Martin," she was declaring with glee. "She's the sort to invite mystery, don't you think? Always clutching her handbag like it contains state secrets." Mrs. Banbury, who ran the bakery, chimed in. "Oh, I don't doubt she heard something. She's quite high-strung. But a whisper? At a garden fete? Really, Agnes? Well, if I were going to haunt anyone," Mrs. Pike continued, "I'd choose a wicker chair too, more poetic than a hat stand." The village's laughter rolled gently, but Miss Marple, who had wandered into the post office to collect a parcel of knitting wool, did not laugh. Instead, she asked Miss Banbury a curious question. "Forgive me, but do you recall what Miss Martin wore yesterday?" Mrs. Banbury blinked. "Something dove gray, wasn't it? Gloves, naturally. Lace at the cuff." "Quite right," Miss Marple replied, though her gloves were intact, and the lace found beneath her chair was torn. She left the room quiet with that small observation and continued on her way to Ivy Fold. Mrs. Blackwood received her in the morning room, a pot of china tea steaming on the tray between them. She looked pale, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I suppose you've heard," she said without preamble. "Only the broad strokes," said Miss Marple. "Though I did hear something about perfume." Double quotes. Mrs. Blackwood nodded. "Yes, Delia said it was like old violets. And then that lace. My poor Ethel nearly fainted." "Violets," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Not a common scent these days. Did you know anyone who wore it?" Mrs. Blackwood hesitated. "Only one, really, Mrs. Nettie Langton. But she's been dead these 7 years. The scent died with her." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her teacup. "And the lace? That's the odd thing. It matches none of Delia's frock, nor any I can remember from yesterday's crowd." And you know how particular village ladies are about noticing such things. That much was certainly true. Mrs. Langton, Miss Marple continued gently. She lived nearby, next door, in Rose Cottage. She passed in her sleep. Her niece inherited the place, though it stood empty ever since. The girl, what was her name? Vivian left for London. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened imperceptibly. Did Mrs. Langton and Miss Martin know one another? Oh yes, Mrs. Blackwood said quickly. They were friends, of a sort. But toward the end, there was unpleasantness, a disagreement over something in the will, I believe. Delia never spoke of it. Miss Marple did not press further, though a quiet rhythm of thought began ticking behind her eyes. Later that afternoon, she visited the church. The air inside was cool, as if even the walls had absorbed a reverence to old Dename. She passed the pews slowly, letting her fingers drift over the polished backs, then stopped by the one closest to the east window. A scent just the faintest breath hung there, not fresh, not overpowering, but clinging, like the memory of something once treasured, old violets. She turned as the vicar entered from the vestry. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said kindly. "Praying for clarity, are we? There's been quite the stir, I hear." "Something of the sort," she replied. "Tell me, Reverend, have there been any unusual visitors to the church recently, besides the usual lost tourists? Not that I recall, though. Now that you mention it." He frowned thoughtfully. "There was a young woman here last Thursday. Sat quite still for nearly an hour in the fourth pew. I thought at first she might be mourning someone, but when I spoke to her, she only smiled and asked whether the garden fete was still held at Ivy Fold. Did she give her name? No, I'm afraid not, but she wore lavender. I remember thinking it looked a touch formal for our sleepy village." Miss Marple considered this. A formal dress, a quiet hour in the church, a question about the fete, and a torn scrap of lace. As she stepped out of the church into the sunlight, the village green ahead of her looked deceptively undisturbed. The wicker chairs would have been returned to storage, the lemonade jug washed and shelved. But Miss Marple had seen enough garden fetes to know that things often lingered like perfume, or guilt, or whispers not carried by the wind. She turned toward Rose Cottage, now shuttered and quiet behind a tangled garden wall. The roses, however, were blooming, deep purple ones, long-stemmed and watchful, just like Mrs. Langton once preferred. Miss Marple paused. The past, she knew, never stayed buried for long in Little Wadsworth, especially not beneath a wicker chair. Chapter 3. The locked cottageite was the quiet sort of afternoon that made the birdsong seem loud. The sky above Little Wadsworth hung low and silvery, promising either rain or secrets, and Miss Marple, armed with nothing more than her parasol and a mild curiosity, made her way along the lane that led to Rose Cottage. The garden had not been tended in months, perhaps years. Wild roses curled around the trellis with an abandon that bordered on impolite. The old gate gave a low moan as she pushed it open. The house itself was small and neat, its paint faded but not peeling. The windows shuttered tightly as if bracing against memory. Miss Marple approached the door but made no attempt to knock. Instead, she stooped beside the threshold, examining the mat with a practiced glance. A few dry leaves, a cluster of rosemary sprigs wind-blown from the hedge, and then a faint scuff. A heel mark, fresh or fresh enough to be worrying. She straightened and turned, just as a voice called from the lane. "Poking about, are we, Miss Marple?" It was Inspector Crail, tall and solid, with a face that gave nothing away but rarely missed a trick. He walked toward her with the easy pace of someone who preferred to take his time, even in matters of murder. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she replied mildly. "I'm only admiring the roses. HMPH noticed you left the fete rather early yesterday." Before the excitement, "An old lady's bones don't take kindly to damp seats," she said sweetly. Crail smiled faintly. And yet I hear you were one of the first to spot the strange behavior. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Merely that Miss Martin seemed unusually distressed. A whisper, a scent, a scrap of lace, it all seems rather theatrical, don't you think? Perhaps too theatrical. She's not the sort to swoon for no reason. Crail stepped past her and tried the cottage door. Locked, as expected. Vivian Langton owns this property, doesn't she? She does, though no one's seen her here in years. He gave the door another tug, more for show than purpose, then turned to Miss Marple. Do you think she's returned? Quietly. I think, said Miss Marple, watching the rose bushes sway in the still air, that the past has its own way of unlocking doors. Crail's gaze followed hers. You always speak in riddles. I find them clearer than some truths, she said softly. He sighed. I'll get a warrant. The place ought to be checked, at any rate. Meanwhile, I suggest you leave the sleuthing to us. Of course. Inspector, she said politely, and watched him walk away with the same expression she might have reserved for a wayward child. Back at the vicarage that evening, she opened her knitting basket, but left the needles untouched. Instead, she pulled out a worn notebook, one in which she kept lists, not of suspects or motives, but of human tendencies. How grief disguises itself, how guilt manifests in the smallest gestures, and how memory, above all, is never quite as faded as one thinks. She added a new note beneath a column labeled Uninvited Returns, Scent of Violets, Miss Martin's Collapse, Rose Cottage heel mark, lavender dress, Thursday visitor. The next morning brought with it a visitor of her own. Delia Blackwood, cheeks flushed and eyes wide, arrived at the vicarage with the urgency of someone carrying news. Or scandal, or both. You'll never believe it, she said, not bothering to wait for the tea tray. Vivian Langton. She's here. Miss Marple arched an eyebrow. In the village? She asked mildly. No, at Rose Cottage. I saw her myself. This morning, from the garden. She was by the window, just standing there, watching. Did she see you? I don't think so. She looked, well, older, of course, paler, but it was her. I'd know that profile anywhere. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Delia, she said gently, have you spoken to Miss Martin since the fete? Delia frowned. No. Why? I wonder if you might visit her. I believe she may have more to say than she initially let on. Delia nodded, puzzled but obedient, and left soon after. Miss Marple returned to her garden path, where the bees worked noisily in the lavender. Something was blooming here too, though not a flower. A pattern, half-formed and delicate. At noon, word came that the inspector had entered Rose Cottage with a constable and found it deserted. No sign of recent habitation beyond a few muddy footprints and a teacup in the sink. Its contents dried to a faint violet ring. Miss Marple received this news without surprise. The ghost had vanished again. But ghosts, she thought, rarely wandered without a reason, and they often came back not for peace, but for resolution. That evening, Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, listening as the church bell struck 6. Outside, shadows stretched across the village like long-forgotten debts. Inside, the vicar fussed with his pipe, unaware of the tight coil of tension winding its way through the air. I do hope Miss Martin is feeling better, he said absently. She's such a sensitive creature. Miss Marple looked out the window to where the outline of Rose Cottage was just visible behind its curtain of ivy. She's sensitive. Yes, she murmured, but not delicate. There's a difference, you know. And with that, she rose and fetched her coat. There were still a few hours of daylight left, and Miss Marple had always believed that some truths were best seen before the sun dipped low, before the shadows distorted what was once clear. As she stepped out onto the lane, her eyes settled on the cracked garden path, the old stone bench, and the wild roses that watched everything in silence. Somewhere beneath their thorn beauty, A secret waited to bloom. Chapter 4. Tea with the Vicar's Wife. Vicarage, with its sun-faded curtains and the faint scent of dried lavender lingering in the hall, was a place of peace. But peace, Miss Marple knew, often masked unrest. That morning, she had taken tea with Mrs. Hartnell, the vicar's wife, a woman whose cheerful exterior hid an unyielding attention to detail. They sat by the parlor window where the spring light filtered through lace and caught the dust mid-air like tiny ghosts. Mrs. Hartnell poured tea with practiced grace and offered a plate of seed cake. "It's this business with Rose Cottage, Jane," she said, her voice low, though they were quite alone. "Everyone's talking about its sightings and whisperings, and now the inspector prowling about." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "Curious, isn't it? Curious is one word. Unnerving is another. You know, I never liked that woman. Vivian Langton always seemed brittle, as though she could snap if pressed. She was an outsider, in many ways, and those are rarely forgiven." Mrs. Hartnell stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I don't suppose you believe she's truly come back?" Miss Marple paused. "Not in the way people imagine, but someone's returned, of that I'm certain." Mrs. Hartnell watched her. "You mean someone connected to her past?" "I mean someone who's found a reason to disturb what was meant to remain buried." At that moment, the front door rattled with an urgent knock. It was Delia Blackwood again, this time pale and breathless, a letter clutched in her hand. "I am sorry to intrude," she stammered, stepping inside without waiting. "But I went to see Miss Martin as you suggested." "And did she speak with you?" Miss Marple asked gently. She tried, but something frightened her. She kept looking at the window as if expecting someone. "Then she handed me this." Delia held out the letter, sealed in a faded envelope. The ink on the front was delicate and precise, to be opened if ever she returns. Miss Marple took it without hesitation and slit the envelope with her silver hairpin. Inside, a single sheet of paper trembled in her hand. "If Vivian returns, it is because she was never far. She told me things I promised never to speak aloud. But if she comes back, then it means something has gone terribly wrong. Check the drawer beneath the wicker chair in the back room." She always said secrets should be kept close to where they were first heard. Miss Marple folded the paper quietly. Mrs. Hartnell, ever practical, rose at once. "You mean to go back to the cottage?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that it's time someone sat in that chair." Inspector Crail did not like being summoned, but when Miss Marple telephoned and mentioned a note, he arrived within the hour. By then, the key to Rose Cottage had been located rather conveniently in the church vestry drawer, a detail that caused Crail's mustache to twitch in suspicion. They entered the cottage together, the musty air clinging like guilt. Miss Marple led the way down a narrow corridor into the rear sitting room. The wicker chair stood by a curtained window, its cushions faded and slightly misshapen. "Charming," Crail muttered. Miss Marple reached beneath the seat and felt along the wooden base until her fingers found a groove. She lifted the false panel gently and drew out a small velvet pouch. Crail took it and emptied the contents onto a side table. A locket, a man's signet ring, and a folded photograph. The locket opened easily. Inside, a lock of dark hair and a miniature portrait of a young woman, Vivian, unmistakably, though she looked softer, younger, less shadowed. The signet ring bore the initials R.A. Not Langton. Crail opened the photograph. 3 figures stood in a sunlit garden. Vivian in the center, smiling, her arm around a young man with a serious face. Beside them, a third figure blurred slightly, perhaps moved as the picture was taken, but a woman, fair-haired and holding a notebook. "This was taken here," Crail murmured. "In this very garden. That bench, same one by the roses." Miss Marple nodded. "Do you recognize the man?" He studied it. "Looks like Richard Alton. He died in a boating accident, must have been 15 years ago. Before your time, perhaps. Vivian Langton was engaged to him once, was she not? For a summer. Then he took up with someone else, left the village under a bit of a cloud. And the fair-haired woman? No idea. Miss Marple tapped the photograph gently. I think Miss Martin might. Crail frowned. You think she's involved? I think she's the only one left alive who knows the story all the way through. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. As twilight settled over little Wadsworth, she lit her lamp and placed the photograph beside her knitting basket. There were patterns forming now, connections that glimmered like dropped stitches. A man gone too soon. A woman returned too late. A whisper in a wicker chair. But still, something didn't sit right. The locket and ring were too intimate, too carefully hidden. Not trophies, keepsakes, mementos of love or betrayal, perhaps both. And then there was the glove, the one found in the pew at the church fete. Left deliberately, perhaps, or dropped in panic. Miss Marple thought of Vivian's dress, lavender, a scent of violets. A memory resurrected. She closed her eyes, recalling an old habit from childhood. She'd listen to conversations through closed doors, not for secrets, but for tone. She learned then that fear has a sound different from guilt. And Miss Martin, when she had collapsed, had sounded terrified, not ashamed. The truth, she knew, was close, but like the rose garden in winter, it was wrapped in thorns. Miss Marple picked up her pen and wrote a brief note. My dear Inspector, I suggest you speak to Miss Martin tonight, before someone ensures her silence. Yours, J.M. Chapter 5. A visitor at dusk. Light in the village had turned the soft gold of late afternoon. By the time Inspector Crail knocked on Miss Martin's modest door, the wind had risen, rustling through the trees in the churchyard beyond, and setting the weather vane on the old schoolhouse squealing faintly with each turn. Miss Martin answered the door with a look of resignation, her eyes shadowed beneath drawn brows. She didn't speak a word, only stepped aside, letting Crail into a sitting room that smelled faintly of old books and rosewater. Crail sat, resting his head on his knee. Miss Martin, he began, keeping his tone even, you gave Miss Blackwood a letter, one that referenced secrets you've kept for some time. May I ask what those secrets concern? Her hands, clasped tightly together, trembled. I don't know that I should say anything more. I understand your hesitation, he said, but I have a photograph, found in Rose Cottage. You're in it, with Miss Langton and Richard Alton. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. He passed the photograph across the small table. Her eyes locked onto it, and a long silence followed. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and lined with old grief. That summer, she said, Vivian asked me to come and stay with her. She'd just gotten engaged to Richard. It was a whirlwind. He had the kind of charm that pulled people into orbit. Vivian was enchanted and frightened. There were arguments, whispers I wasn't supposed to hear, about money, about someone else. Someone else? She nodded, her eyes distant. A girl from the neighboring village. Helen, I think. There was talk that Richard had promised her marriage, too, but he denied it. Said she misunderstood. Did Vivian believe him? I don't think she did, but she wouldn't give him up. She said love was like drowning once you were under. The struggle just made it worse. Crail frowned. And then he died. Miss Martin nodded slowly. A boating accident, they said. But I never believed it was just that. Vivian returned from the hospital, changed, not just grieving, watchful, paranoid. And she started hiding things. The locket, the ring, the photograph. She asked me to keep them safe. Told me they were dangerous. Crail sat forward. Dangerous how? She never said. Only that if anything ever happened to her, if she ever went missing, or returned under suspicious circumstances, I should bring them to light. And then she disappeared, without a word. One day she was in the garden, clipping back the rose canes. The next, her cottage was locked and empty. Crail leaned back, the lines on his forehead deepening. And now someone claiming to be her has returned. Miss Martin met his gaze. That's not Vivian. Back at her own cottage. Miss Marple had just poured a cup of tea when young Delia arrived again, this time with a tremor in her hands and a queer expression in her eyes. I saw someone watching the churchyard, she said without greeting. From just behind the yew trees. A woman? Miss Marple asked gently. Delia nodded. In a long coat. Pale scarf. I tried to approach, but she disappeared, vanished. Almost. Miss Marple set down her cup. Ghost stories are often encouraged when someone has something to hide. You think someone wants us to believe in Vivian's return, to distract us? Miss Marple tilted her head. That's precisely the sort of diversion one employs when truth is inconvenient. But here's a question. Who benefits from resurrecting Vivian Langton's ghost? Delia frowned. Not Miss Martin. No, nor the inspector, certainly. But someone does. Miss Marple rose and retrieved the photograph from her cabinet drawer. She handed it to Delia. Do you recognize the third person? Delia peered closely. That looks like my Aunt Eleanor. Eleanor Blackwood. She died 2 years ago. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Your mother's sister. Delia nodded. Why? Miss Marple's thoughts moved quickly, like knitting needles threading loops in midair. Because your aunt was once very close to Richard Alton, was she not? Yes, she and Richard were involved. Briefly, Mother said it ended badly. Which means Vivian's return or the illusion of her return may threaten more than memories. Delia looked up sharply. You think someone in my family? I think ghosts are rarely summoned without purpose. And when a dead woman returns with whispers of the past, one must ask, what did she know that someone still alive wishes buried? Later that evening, Inspector Crail called on Miss Marple with an update. Miss Martin told me she believes the woman at Rose Cottage isn't Vivian Langton. Miss Marple nodded. As I suspected. She insists the original Vivian was haunted after Alton's death. She feared someone, perhaps a member of his family, had orchestrated it. Miss Marple poured tea without spilling a drop. And now, someone is orchestrating her return. Crail took the offered cup and sipped. The timing is suspect. The fate, the glove, the woman's appearance. It's theatrical, as if arranged for maximum visibility. Miss Marple mused. A glove in a church pew where it's certain to be noticed by the right kind of observer. Not an accident then, no, a message, or a warning. The room fell quiet for a long moment. Crail set his cup down. We'll need to re-examine Richard Alton's death. Perhaps it wasn't as accidental as recorded. Miss Marple nodded and looked closely at the Blackwoods. Family trees grow the strangest fruit. As Crail stood to leave, the church bell tolled once deep, echoing through the twilight. Miss Marple turned to the window. Outside, the wind had picked up again, stirring the ivy across the garden wall. Death, she murmured, leaves its shadow long after the body is buried. And in little Wadsworth, that shadow had just begun to stretch again. Chapter 6. The photograph and the Wisperth next morning dawned with a stubborn mist, clinging low to the hedgerows and obscuring the tops of the church spire and chimneys in Little Wadsworth. It was the kind of morning where the village held its breath, neither fully awake nor entirely at rest. The events of the fate, the mysterious glove, and the strange woman who may or may not have been Vivian Langton still clung to the air, like the mist itself, settling into every conversation and corner of the village. Miss Marple, wrapped in a shawl the color of faded lavender, took her tea at the kitchen table and reread a letter from her cousin Mildred in Torquay. It was mostly talk of rheumatic knees and disagreements over gardening society committees. But Miss Marple's eyes were not on the page. Her mind circled around the photograph that had surfaced 3 figures. One long dead, one vanished, and one said to have returned from the dead dot at 9:30. She buttoned her coat and stepped out into the fog. Her path took her not to the police station, nor to the church, but to a small cottage nestled near the western edge of the village, the home of Mr. Edgar Trumbull, former solicitor, now a widower in semi-retirement. Miss Marple suspected he still knew more than he let on, especially about old family matters. Mr. Trumbull was already trimming his rose bushes when Miss Marple arrived. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with a courteous nod. "What brings you out so early?" "I wonder," said Miss Marple with a smile, "if I might trouble you with a question of family inheritance." "Ah," he chuckled. "Someone's after Cousin Judith's teacups, are they?" "No, not exactly." She accepted the cup of tea he poured her in the small conservatory and set it down untouched. "It's about the Alton estate." Trumbull's eyes narrowed slightly. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in years. Richard Alton died young. Boating accident, they said." "That's right. Just before his marriage to Vivian Langton. Did the estate pass to her?" There was a pause. "It should have," Trumbull said. They were engaged, and Richard had drawn up a will very hastily. "I might add naming her as the primary beneficiary, but it was never signed." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Then who inherited?" "His sister, Margaret Alton, older by 4 years. She never married. Lived in London, worked in publishing. Is she still alive?" "She passed 3 years ago." Miss Marple looked out through the misted glass. "Then who is the heir now?" "There's only one. Her goddaughter Delia Blackwood." Miss Marple turned her gaze back to him. "Then Delia is the sole inheritor of the Alton estate?" "Yes," Trumbull said slowly, now catching the current of her thought. "But none of this would matter unless someone like Vivian were to return," Miss Marple finished. They sat in silence for a long moment. Meanwhile, Inspector Crail had taken it upon himself to re-examine the sealed file. From the old boating accident, it had required a bit of digging, but the report still existed in the archives at county headquarters. Vivian Langton had been found unconscious at the riverbank, her clothes soaked, her forehead bruised. Richard Alton's body was discovered some hours later, caught against a cluster of reeds. The conclusion at the time had been accidental drowning, following a collision with a partially submerged tree limb. But the coroner's note, hastily written and barely legible, contained one curious phrase: "Possible bruising inconsistent with drowning." Crail ran his fingers along the typewritten lines, then turned to the last page, where Vivian's own statement was recorded. He stood. He shouted. The boat tilted. "I don't remember falling. The water was dark. It wasn't much, but it didn't quite align with the evidence. And now, years later, the supposed victim had returned. Unless, of course, it wasn't Vivian at all." Miss Marple, back in her cottage, invited Delia to tea that afternoon. She offered lemon biscuits and a kind smile, which Delia, looking slightly worn and distracted, accepted without resistance. "Delia, dear," Miss Marple began lightly, "do you remember much about your Aunt Eleanor's early life?" Delia blinked. "Not particularly. She and Mother weren't close in later years. I remember Aunt Eleanor being very proud, never spoke of mistakes. She was once courted by Richard Alton, wasn't she?" Delia's face flushed a little. "That's what I've heard. Though my mother said it ended badly." "Was it after Richard met Vivian?" "I think so. I remember once overhearing my aunt say something very bitter about broken promises and women who take what doesn't belong to them." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "And now, someone is pretending to be Vivian. Someone whose presence might jeopardize your inheritance." Delia looked up sharply. "You don't think I had anything to do with that?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I never think the obvious, my dear, but I do think someone is trying very hard to make the past seem alive again. And I wonder, who benefits most from that illusion?" That evening, a note was slipped under Miss Marple's door. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible. "Meet me by the old light gate. Midnight. Volt." Miss Marple stood very still in her hallway. The note smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs. She tucked it into her apron pocket and waited until the clock struck 12. The light gate, bordering the overgrown path behind the churchyard, was cold and deserted when she arrived. Fog twisted through the graves, and the old wrought iron gate creaked on its hinges. A shadow detached itself from the stone wall. "Miss Marple." A voice whispered. Yes. The woman stepped closer, face partially obscured by a veil. Her voice trembled. "I am Vivian Langton. I swear it." Miss Marple said nothing. The woman drew something from her coat, a small silver locket. Inside, a faded photograph, Vivian and Richard, arm in arm beside the river. "I kept this all these years, hidden. I knew they'd try to destroy it." Miss Marple's eyes never left her face. "Why return now?" Vivian hesitated. "Because I was threatened. I was told to stay away, or I'd be next. But now Margaret is dead. And Delia. She's not innocent. Did Delia threaten you?" Vivian shook her head. "Not directly. But I received letters, anonymous, warning me to keep silent. And then the glove. That wasn't mine. It was Eleanor's." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Why leave it in the pew?" "I didn't. Someone wanted to summon attention to force a confrontation." A distant sound echoed, a twig snapping underfoot. Both women turned. A figure darted into the mist and vanished. Miss Marple clutched her shawl tighter. "Come with me, Miss Langton. I think it's time we bring this into the light." Chapter 7. A truth to tie-dye. Following morning dawned wet and gray, as if the skies themselves sensed that the warmth of summer had curdled into suspicion. The morning rain had tamped down the dust on the village lanes, lending a hush to Elmridge that felt unnatural, as though the place were holding its breath. Miss Marple had not attended the chapel service that morning, an unusual omission that was noted by the more observant pew dwellers. But she had not been idle. Instead, she had spent her morning in the company of Bessie Carter, whose thin voice and nervous glances revealed more than the words she carefully chose. It was just a noise, really, Bessie had murmured, hands fidgeting with the teacup Miss Marple had so thoughtfully provided, a scraping under the vicariage's garden window. The night before Miss Howard was found, Miss Marple had nodded softly, filing away the detail. "And did you mention this to the constable, my dear?" "Oh, no," Bessie said quickly. "Didn't seem right to get involved. I'm just the cleaner. Nobody listens to cleaners anyway. Except," she paused, realizing what she had said, "except those who know where to listen." Miss Marple finished gently. Bessie had given her a look of profound gratitude before whispering. "There was a glove, too, not the one they found in the pew. This one was damp and muddy, left behind near the compost pile. Brown leather. I thought perhaps it belonged to the gardener. But the gardener, Miss Marple knew, had not been employed at the vicarage for nearly 2 months. A quiet man with stiff joints and a liking for boiled sweets. Mr. Cartwell had retired in May and moved to stay with a sister in Somerset. A replacement had yet to be found. That detail, like a tiny burr, snagged in her mind. Later that day, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Brathwaite, stopped by Miss Marple's cottage bearing what she claimed was plum jam, though it had the color and consistency of cough syrup. "I do hope we're not overburdening you with all this awful business," she said, eyes flitting about the room as though expecting a culprit to leap from behind the settee. "It's just that people say you have a way." Miss Marple chuckled, folding her hands in her lap. "People say many things, my dear, usually while forgetting that I have ears like anyone else." Mrs. Brathwaite flushed slightly but forged ahead. "It's about George Penry, the verger. Did you know he's been seen about the village at odd hours? I overheard Elsie Thorne say he was out walking the lane behind the church at nearly midnight on Tuesday, and he didn't deny it." "I see," Miss Marple said, tilting her head. "And might George not have his own reasons for moonlit walks? Well, yes, I suppose. But oh, Jane, I must tell you something dreadfully improper. It's the widow Channing, I think she's been entertaining company." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." She claims she's still in mourning for her husband. And yet, there's been a man seen leaving her back garden gate after dusk, twice last week. And you believe that man to be Mr. Henry? No one's certain. But she had some connection to Miss Howard years ago, something about a financial quarrel. Though neither would speak of it openly, Miss Marple's smile never wavered. But inside, her mind turned the threads over. The widow Channing, quiet, self-possessed, and always wrapped in a shawl, even when the weather didn't require it. The sort of woman who could disappear into her role without ever being questioned. And yet, there was also the matter of the missing hymn book. The police had asked, discreetly, if anyone had seen Miss Howard's hymnal, which had disappeared sometime between the Wednesday service and the morning she was found. It was a minor point, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest disturbances could cause the loudest echoes. The next evening brought another development, as Sergeant Cornwell knocked at Miss Marple's door, hat in hand, with an expression that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. "We found something, Miss Marple, behind the stone wall near the old rectory path, a parcel wrapped in oilcloth." He placed it gently on her table, unwrapping the fabric with care. Inside lay a copy of hymns, ancient and modern, water-damaged but unmistakable. Tucked within its pages, flattened between Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, was a brittle, pressed violet petal, dark, dried, and eerily intact. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "How curious," she murmured. "Psalm 42. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? Such a sorrowful choice. There's more." Cornwell said grimly. The page edges had been cut, hollowed out like a hiding place. "We think something else had been inside, perhaps a letter." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of the book, feeling its subtle unevenness. "Or a note of blackmail," she said softly. "Something worth killing for." Cornwell's brows furrowed. "You believe this was planned, then, not a sudden impulse?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, standing, "that the truth is far too tidy." The following morning, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the church. Reverend Brathwaite had taken to walking the grounds, fingers steepled behind his back, his expression a mixture of shame and worry. He greeted Miss Marple with a grave nod. "They've begun to whisper," he said, "that this house of worship has become a house of secrets." "All houses are," Miss Marple replied. "The only difference is whether one looks beneath the wicker chairs." The Reverend blinked. She continued, "Reverend, do you remember a sermon from 6 weeks ago? Something about confession and the burden of silence?" He nodded, puzzled. "Yes, it was part of the liturgical calendar. Miss Howard wept that day, silently. I watched her from the back, and she gripped her hymnal so tightly I thought the cover would tear. You think she was hiding something. I think she was holding something. Something she didn't dare leave behind." A shadow fell across the entry as George Penry entered, offering them both a stiff smile that Miss Marple watched him with quiet interest. The way his left hand twitched ever so slightly, the almost imperceptible change in his gait since their last encounter. "It's always the pews, isn't it?" she said to no one in particular. "We assume they are passive things, waiting, but they are where everything is both heard and hidden." Mr. Penry, pale now, opened his mouth as if to protest, but then said nothing at all. By the afternoon, a single name floated across the teacups and hat pins of Elmridge like a ghost: Lydia Channing. The widow had left her home by then, just after the noon bell. Seen boarding the 10 train to Oxford. Her house was shuttered, the shawls folded, the garden trimmed to tidy, indeed. But Miss Marple remained in her sitting room. A lace-edged envelope resting on her lap. It contained no confession, only a pressed violet, identical to the one in the hollowed hymnal. And beneath it, the words, "Forgive me," for the silence was too long, and the truth too heavy. Chapter 8. The Ink Beneath the Veneerth. Next morning in St. Aldhelm's arrived with a sky mottled gray and gold, as if the weather itself was hesitant to choose between charm and melancholy. The mist had mostly cleared, replaced by a sharp breeze that rattled the faded bunting still dangling across the vicarage garden. A quiet, almost reverent stillness lingered over the village, broken only by the occasional rumble of a milk cart or the bark of a dog. Too young to respect solemn moods, Miss Marple sat quietly in her favorite chair by the window of her cottage, the one overlooking the churchyard. A fine embroidery hoop lay on her lap, the thread idling between her fingers. But her mind, ever precise and observant, was far from idle. Yesterday's revelations had left her with more questions than answers. Mr. Roper's blundering confession about the missing clock, coupled with young Jeremy Blaine's curious defense of the vicar's wife, had scratched at something deeper than simple theft or petty jealousy. And then there was that cryptic whisper she'd overheard from inside the vestry. During her supposed nap, it wasn't supposed to be Violet. Violet, again. The late Miss Violet Dunning had been a creature of routine and habit. Her pew was always third from the back, left side, precisely beneath the stained glass depiction of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost cousins. She always wore pale lavender gloves and carried a small sachet of rosewater in her purse. She had, as far as anyone knew, no enemies and no scandal except, perhaps, for the slight tension between her and Mrs. Calthorpe, who had once been publicly corrected about the arrangement of the altar flowers. And yet, Miss Violet Dunning was now dead, found slumped at the end of the harvest tea, her teacup overturned, a faint trace of almond, and something. "I see," Miss Marple said, tilting her head. "And might George not have his own reasons for moonlit walks? Well, yes, I suppose. But oh, Jane, I must tell you something dreadfully improper. It's the widow Channing. I think she's been entertaining company." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You don't say. She claims she's still in mourning for her husband. And yet, there's been a man seen leaving her back garden gate after dusk, twice last week. And you believe that man to be Mr. Henry? No one's certain. But she had some connection to Miss Howard years ago, something about a financial quarrel. Though neither would speak of it openly, Miss Marple's smile never wavered. But inside, her mind turned the threads over. The widow Channing, quiet, self-possessed, and always wrapped in a shawl, even when the weather didn't require it. The sort of woman who could disappear into her role without ever being questioned. And yet, there was also the matter of the missing hymn book. The police had asked, discreetly, if anyone had seen Miss Howard's hymnal, which had disappeared some time between the Wednesday service and the morning she was found. It was a minor point, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest disturbances could cause the loudest echoes. The next evening brought another development, as Sergeant Cornwell knocked at Miss Marple's door, hat in hand, with an expression that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. "We found something, Miss Marple, behind the stone wall near the old rectory path, a parcel wrapped in oilcloth." He placed it gently on her table, unwrapping the fabric with care. Inside lay a copy of hymns, ancient and modern, water-damaged but unmistakable. Tucked within its pages, flattened between Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, was a brittle, pressed violet petal, dark, dried, and eerily intact. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "How curious," she murmured. "Psalm 42. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? Such a sorrowful choice." "There's more," Cornwell said grimly. The page edges had been cut, hollowed out like a hiding place. "We think something else had been inside, perhaps a letter." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of the book, feeling its subtle unevenness. "Or a note of blackmail," she said softly. "Something worth killing for." Cornwell's brows furrowed. You believe this was planned, then, not a sudden impulse? I believe, Miss Marple said, standing, that the truth is far too tidy. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the church. Reverend Brathwaite had taken to walking the grounds, fingers steepled behind his back, his expression a mixture of shame and worry. He greeted Miss Marple with a grave nod. They've begun to whisper, he said, that this house of worship has become a house of secrets. All houses are, Miss Marple replied. The only difference is whether one looks beneath the wicker chairs. The Reverend blinked. She continued, Reverend, do you remember a sermon from 6 weeks ago? Something about confession and the burden of silence? He nodded, puzzled. Yes, it was part of the liturgical calendar. Miss Howard wept that day, silently. I watched her from the back, and she gripped her hymnal so tightly I thought the cover would tear. You think she was hiding something. I think she was holding something. Something she didn't dare leave behind. A shadow fell across the entry as George Penry entered, offering them both a stiff smile that Miss Marple watched him with quiet interest. The way his left hand twitched ever so slightly, the almost imperceptible change in his gait since, I don't mind clutter. Clutter reveals character, with a hesitant nod. Lavinia led her down the narrow hall and opened the vestry door. The small chamber smelled of wax and dust and something faintly sharp, like old vinegar. Miss Marple stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the wooden floorboards, the narrow cupboard filled with hymnals, and the locked drawer beneath the desk. Her gaze came to rest on a small blotter by the writing stand, well used, stained in places, but not with ink. No, this was something powdery, as if talcum had been spilled and partially wiped away. May I? Miss Marple asked, before Lavinia could object. She had drawn a handkerchief and gently pressed the edge to the residue. It smudged just slightly, but the smell that rose from it was distinct. Bitter almonds. She turned to the vicar's wife, who had gone quite still. Miss Dunning's death was unexpected, said Miss Marple softly. But it was not natural, and someone knew she would be sitting exactly where she was, at exactly that moment. Lavinia's fingers trembled at her sides. Are you accusing? No, dear. I am merely observing. But the vestry, you see, is not a place for secrets. At that moment, the door creaked open again. The vicar stood there, expression unreadable. Lavinia, he said, perhaps you should go rest. She nodded silently and brushed past them. Not meeting Miss Marple's eyes, Reverend Hargreaves remained still for a long moment, then stepped fully into the room. I trust you have a reason for this. Miss Marple, only curiosity, she said mildly, and a fondness for order. The vicar's face remained passive, but a flicker crossed his brow. I assume you'll be speaking to Inspector Cray. Eventually, said Miss Marple. But not yet. She turned to leave, her gaze sweeping once more over the scene. The glove, the whisper, the powder, the shifting blame, and a figure in a long coat beneath the moon. Outside, the church bell rang for noon dot, and Miss Marple, quiet and steady, walked back toward her cottage, her mind already several steps ahead. Chapter 9. A study in shadowed storm that had threatened all afternoon finally broke over St. Jude's shortly after midnight, washing the sleepy village in sheets of rain. It rattled the gutters of the vicarage and turned the narrow lanes into glistening trails of lamplight. At the old mill cottage, however, Miss Marple sat by her modest hearth, a shawl about her shoulders, her knitting motionless in her lap. She was not watching the flames, she was watching the patterns of behavior play themselves out in the theater of her mind. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind the clean scent of wet earth and a damp calmness that clung to every hedge and windowsill. And yet, beneath that calm, tension brewed. At breakfast, Reverend Claiborne looked pale and distracted. His wife, Agnes, asked whether he'd slept. and he murmured something about needing to speak with Inspector Crispin. The inspector had already paid a visit to Mrs. Pym's house at dawn, having received word from young Ada, the maid, that someone had disturbed the study. I didn't touch anything, sir, Ada had insisted, her apron still damp from scrubbing. But the drawer was half open, and the curtains were drawn. Mr. Pym always left them open. Indeed, something had been rifled through in Mr. Pym's study, though no items were missing. A set of documents relating to the church's land deeds had been removed and hastily stuffed back in the wrong order. Inspector Crispin had gone straight from there to the vicarage. Reverend Claiborne was waiting with his coat already on. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, he said, offering the inspector a battered leather notebook. I found this tucked behind the organ loft in a cracked tile. I believe you'll find it relevant to your inquiry. The inspector opened it. The pages were covered in closely written notes in a jagged hand, including names, dates, and curious symbols, and at the bottom of several entries was a single initial, E. Meanwhile, Miss Marple made her way to the church once more. She had requested the spare key from the verger with the innocent smile that masked the razor. Behind her curiosity, what she sought was not a clue in the ordinary sense, it was confirmation of something. She had quietly begun to suspect. The pew where the glove had been found was empty, as expected. But the wicker chair, the one she had sat in during the tea that followed the christening, had been moved. She examined it carefully. Wicker can betray secrets. The weave was slightly pulled near the left side, and tucked between two overlapping ribs was a scrap of paper. She teased it out gently. It was a page torn from a church hymnal, but across the lyrics of Abide With Me had been scrawled, in red pencil, the name Eleanor Dene. Miss Marple folded it delicately and placed it in her handbag. That afternoon, a quiet commotion stirred at the post office. Mrs. Farley, usually composed to the point of frostiness, had been seen slamming her window closed and retreating to the back, trembling. Word spread quickly that she had received an anonymous letter unsigned, the handwriting clumsy and childlike, warning her to keep out of it or the next whisper will be yours. The phrase caused a stir. The next whisper quickly became the gossip of the day. Miss Marple, sipping her tea with Mr. Stringer at the library, absorbed the development with measured calm. Eleanor Dean again, she murmured. The poor girl's reputation won't survive this, regardless of her involvement. And yet, I still can't quite make the pieces settle. Mr. Stringer looked at her. Do you think she's innocent, then? Miss Marple dabbed her lips with a napkin. My dear Mr. Stringer, innocence and guilt are rarely such binary concepts in a place like this. I think she is caught in something far older than she understands, and I think someone is rather hoping will continue looking at her while they stand quietly in the wings. That evening, Eleanor Dean herself knocked on Miss Marple's door. Rain had returned, and her cloak clung to her like ivy. I know everyone thinks I did it, she said without preamble, and I don't blame them. I was the last one in the church, and I lied about it. But I didn't kill Mr. Pym. I didn't. Miss Marple guided her gently to the parlor. Why lie, dear? Eleanor's lip trembled. Because I heard something, just before the body was found. A whisper like someone murmuring my name. It frightened me. I thought if I told anyone, they'd think I was mad. Miss Marple patted her hand. Did you recognize the voice? I know. It was like a breath, not a voice. I thought maybe it was just the wind in the rafters. But then, that glove and the letter to Mrs. Farley. It's like someone wants us to believe the church itself is speaking. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Or someone wishes to use that fear. That's a more likely scenario. Eleanor stood, her hands clenched. Then you believe me? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that the truth is very close now. But it is hidden beneath shame and silence, and one must not disturb such things without care. Inspector Crispin, too, was growing uneasy. The notebook from the organ loft had contained several cryptic references to meetings in the church late at night, but no definitive proof of who had been attending them then. As the village prepared for the harvest festival, something happened that jolted the case forward once more. During preparations in the vestry, Agnes Claiborne opened a box of decorations and gave a startled cry. Nestled beneath the dried garlands of lavender and marigold was a bundle of scorched paper. They were pages from Reverend Claiborne's old sermons, pages that had been burned at the edges, then doused perhaps hastily in panic. One bore a smear of what looked like blood. It was Miss Marple, who arrived later. When the inspector summoned her in private, "I've had the papers tested," Crispin said quietly. "The blood is human. And Reverend Claiborne? He said he didn't know how they got there, but that's beginning to sound less plausible. His wife is in pieces." Miss Marple nodded. "Have you considered that this entire affair is not about violence, but about confession? And that perhaps the murderer has been trying desperately to atone?" Crispin stared. "You think the killer is remorseful?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that guilt makes people do the strangest things. Even return to the scene over and over again. Even leave messages in hymnals and chairs." The inspector frowned. "You mean all these notes are not threats?" Miss Marple finished. "They're cries. Someone wants to be caught, but only by the person who understands them." That night, Miss Marple sat again by her fire, her knitting untouched. She was waiting, and sure enough, as the clock struck midnight, there came a knock at the back door. Faint, hesitant, she opened it to find Agnes Claiborne, trembling in the dark, soaked through. "I had to come," she whispered. "There's something you need to know, something I buried years ago. Before I ever came to St. Jude's." Miss Marple stepped aside. "Then come in, my dear. The kettle is just on the boil." Chapter 10. The whisper that wanted to be heard. The storm had passed for the final time. Morning came to St. Jude's bathed in a fragile, golden stillness, as if the village itself were holding its breath. But within the warm quiet of Miss Marple's sitting room, a reckoning was underway. Agnes Claiborne sat hunched on the floral sofa, her damp gloves twisted in her lap. Her face was pale, worn not from sleeplessness, but from years of concealment. Miss Marple, calm and kindly, sat opposite her, hands folded neatly. "Take your time, dear," she said gently. Agnes looked up, her voice catching. "It's not about Eleanor or Mr. Pym, not really. It's about something I've carried since I was 19. I was once someone else. Agnes Marion. My father was the choir master at St. Bathild's in Berkshire. A good man, strict but fair." Miss Marple waited. "One winter," Agnes continued, "a girl in the choir went missing. Her name was Mary Cattle. The village whispered, but nothing was ever proven. I saw something. My father, in the bell tower with her arguing. And then, the sound of bells," her voice broke. "I was too frightened to speak, too ashamed. I fled the village and changed my name. I married Peter Claiborne later, and he never knew." "And the whispers?" Miss Marple prompted softly. Agnes looked haunted. "It began again, when we arrived here, first in dreams, then in waking hours. I heard her voice sometimes in the church. I thought I was going mad, but then I found the hymn page tucked into the wicker chair. Abide with me, her favorite, and I thought was someone else watching me. Was it her?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, dear, but someone knew your past, and they used it to steer suspicion away from themselves." Agnes stared. "Who?" "It was at the vicarage, an hour later, where the final gathering took place. Inspector Crispin, Reverend Claiborne, Miss Marple, Eleanor Dean, and Mrs. Farley all assembled in the small drawing room. Miss Marple stood before the fireplace, composed and watchful. "There has been," she began, "a very clever misdirection at play, but not one of grand schemes or master criminals. Rather, it was rooted, as it often is, in shame, fear, and a desperate need to remain hidden. She turned to the Reverend. You believed your wife's past might ruin her. And so, when the first whisper appeared on that page in the church, you assumed someone knew, and you tried to protect her. Peter Claiborne nodded solemnly. Yes, I burned the sermon pages she had annotated with strange notes. I hid the notebook in the organ loft. I didn't know what to do. You did what husbands often do, panicked, Miss Marple said gently. She turned next to Eleanor. And you, poor child, believed the whispers were meant to condemn you, because you were the last to see Mr. Pym. But you, too, were being used. Someone relied on your skittishness to keep attention focused on your behavior. Eleanor blinked rapidly. Then, who did it? Miss Marple turned to the final person in the room, Mrs. Farley. Ethel Farley, she said quietly. You've spent a lifetime behind the post office window, watching every soul in this village. You delivered letters, but you also listened. And when you discovered that Edwin Pym had been keeping a journal of confidential conversations, some of which included your own history, you knew he might expose something you'd buried long ago. Mrs. Farley didn't flinch. She simply raised her chin. He said he would write a sermon about hypocrisy, about judgment. He said it was time to name names. Miss Marple nodded. And you couldn't allow that. Not after what you did to Mary Cottle's brother. The false accusation, the exile. Mrs. Farley's voice was steady. He would have ruined everything. My position, my peace. You waited after the christening, didn't you? Miss Marple said. Slipped back through the vestry. He was alone. All you had to do was strike him once with the iron candle holder. The room went still. And then, Miss Marple continued, you began the game of whispers, leaving that hymn page, sending yourself the warning note, feeding the idea that something supernatural was afoot, all to cloud the truth. Inspector Crispin stepped forward, face grim. You're under arrest, Mrs. Farley. The postmistress stood, calmly removed her brooch, and handed it to the inspector. I did what I had to keep the village pure. No, said Miss Marple, softly. You did it to keep your secrets. But secrets, you see, don't stay buried. They echo, like whispers beneath chairs, and someone always hears them. In the days that followed, the village returned to its routines, albeit with a wary eye toward the post office. Agnes Claiborne was finally able to sleep, unburdened of the past. Eleanor Dean left town quietly, suitcase in hand, with a letter from Miss Marple tucked inside, wishing her courage and a future unmarred by fear. And Miss Marple? She returned to her garden. The chair sat peacefully under the hawthorn tree, the breeze stirring its wicker threads. She sat, resumed her knitting, and smiled. The whisper had been heard.